if he can claim, emerge from this whole saga. I mean, at the moment there's no end in sight, but if he can emerge as the person who kind of rolled back Iran's axis of resistance across the Middle East, then he would see that as something to be proud of and something that would put him down in Israeli history as one of their most successful prime ministers.
1 year on, I'll start with something simple, I guess. What's your sort of reflections of October the 7th, 2023, and then the year that we've had since?
Well, October the 7th, 2023 will go down as one of those dates in history like 9/11 or something of that scale. In the UK, we have 7/7 that kind of reflects the gravity of that terror attack and, 1,200 people dying, another 250 taken hostage in the most appalling slaughter of Jewish people since the Holocaust, the worst single day of Jewish bloodshed since the Holocaust. And also it kind of it erupted it led to events erupting across the Middle East, and I think it's worth reflecting in the months and weeks before that. Jake Sullivan, who was the US National Security Advisor, had said, well, we don't need to pay attention to the Middle East. We've got other fish to fry. We've got China, we've got Ukraine and Russia. And then suddenly the Middle East, in one shocking event, completely dominated and has really done in the years since.
Do you think that was the view internationally at that point, that that it was an area that there was, I guess, some complacency around?
Well, that is it. I mean, there was a degree to which, bear in mind there had been the normalization that Israel had secured, the Abraham Accords with a number of Arab countries. There seemed to be the prospect of a Saudi deal as well, which would have been a major coup for Benjamin Netanyahu, and he's actually raised that again since as still an aim. And so it was all about, Israel seemed to be kind of establishing a more of a normal relationship with its neighbours again, and to a degree this is what threatened groups like Hamas, terror groups like Hamas, which is that they were aware that the Palestinian cause had been sidelined and that it was in retreat almost in the lead up to that, and they also, you have to say, were thought they could prey on the divisions within Israeli society. So there had been huge protests just in the lead up to October the 7th against Benjamin Netanyahu's judicial reforms. There had been a period of 5 elections in 4 years. Eventually, Netanyahu had secured a coalition, but that included some of the most extremist ministers who there had ever been in Israel. So it felt in the lead up to this, appalling massacre that they scented an opportunity and they struck. And there was also the idea that, the main threat, as Israel perceived it as at the time, was from Hezbollah in the north, the kind of Iranian-backed proxy, with a kind of strong link to Iran. And that's not to say there was no link between Hamas and Iran, but it wasn't, as under the thumb from Tehran, put it that way. And there was a sense to which the Israeli security establishment took their eye off the ball on Hamas and no longer regarded them as a principal threat compared to what was happening in the north and how wrong they proved to be.
You were out there, weren't you, quite quickly after October the 7th, and I think you've been back a few times since. How would you say the mood in and around Israel and then in and around Gaza has changed over 12 months?
I think it's hard to underplay the trauma and the shock that is still there in Israeli society, and the pain. I had to attend funerals of some of the people who lost their lives on October the 7th. I remember there was one I had to go to, which was a British Israeli woman and her 2 daughters who were 2 teenagers, and the emotion will still it comes back straight away, and I can feel that moment. And for Israel itself as a country, it's still there a year on. Everywhere posters of the hostages, and everyone has the kind of yellow ribbons to reflect the hostages. So the pain is very much still there. But increasingly, or there has been until recently, and the recent offensive in the north, but there had been divisions within Israeli society about what to do next. And there were still 97 hostages, of which we think 33 are probably dead, still in Gaza. What was the best way to get them back? And Netanyahu has kind of always resisted a ceasefire deal and a hostage exchange, and he was facing mass protests and divisions even within his cabinet over the terms of that ceasefire deal and why he was rejecting it. But what we've seen since the Israelis have gone into Lebanon is that issue seems to have become sidelined again, and we've kind of returned to Netanyahu is in fact climbing in the polls at the moment.
When you think of and can still feel that pain that you've just described, there are huge numbers of people worldwide, of course, that think that Israel's response has gone too far. Can you understand how that anger can manifest itself in what Israel has done since? Or do you, even having experienced it, think there has to be levels, there has to be degrees to which you're not prepared to cross?
Well, I think the international community for however many months, 9 months, 10 months now, has called for a ceasefire in Gaza. Nothing has managed to achieve that. I remember I went down to Kerem Shalom, which is the main crossing between Gaza and Egypt and Israel. It's like, where all those three borders meet in the corner down there. And this was when there were extremist protests from the Israelis trying to stop food and water getting into Gaza, despite the deplorable humanitarian situation there. Because they were seen as, this would all be seized by Hamas, and therefore we cannot allow any humanitarian aid in. There was always a sense that the response would be pretty crushing. And the international community has tried its best to restrain Israel and talk Israel down, but so far that hasn't really happened, and you have to question what leverage other countries have over Israel, with the exception of the US, arguably very little.
I think that's a good area to go into there to talk a bit about the American situation, because it seemed, hasn't it, generally speaking, that no matter what Joe Biden has suggested to Benjamin Netanyahu, he's pretty much ignored, perhaps with the exception of going straight into Iran. We think that there are still sort of negotiations ongoing. Do you feel like the world order, in terms of the really most powerful countries in the world, might have changed a little bit here because of the apparent ignoring of their demands?
Yeah, I think you also have to reflect on the domestic situation in the US. Biden is approaching the end of his presidency. There was a lot of debate earlier about how long he would continue, so his authority has kind of drained away as this process has gone on, as it's become clear that he won't be there for the long haul. Then you have a US election, so you have candidates kind of eyeing that up. So you've got the US at the same time thinking about itself and its own internal politics. And they did stop, one shipment of bombs at one point, but they, this is a drop in the ocean compared to the aid and the weapons they have continued to transfer and sell. So, besides the US, there is no real country that I would argue that Israel would pay much attention to, and if anything, there's a sense in which, I'm from England, I'm from London, and, there are plenty of British Israelis, and when you go, and, their perception of England, a lot of people, British Israelis, is that, London is no longer a safe place to be Jewish, that, they see protests, and this must have happened several times. I'm standing somewhere where a rocket siren might have gone off a second ago, and then suddenly, a British Israeli will say, well, it's mad, but I feel safer here than I do in London. And they'll acknowledge that's kind of crazy. But I should also add as well, we concentrate on the events in Gaza, now increasingly in Lebanon as well. But let's not lose fact of what's happening in the West Bank, and I think the developments there are important. And if you look at the original name of the Hamas terror attack, it was called the Al-Aqsa Flood, in reference to Jerusalem and what was happening at the Al-Aqsa mosque complex there. And, the kind of turbocharging of settlement in the West Bank, despite, again, Western attempts to kind of restrain this Israeli government, again, kind of points to, it makes the idea of this two-state solution and any kind of long-term solution to this, awful conflict appear further and further away.
There are people who are looking at the situation in Lebanon with quite sort of cynical eyes in terms of the timing of it for Benjamin Netanyahu, because you come to a year since October the 7th, 2023, with the sort of political position he was in prior to going into Lebanon, and the strength of feeling against him gets louder and louder and louder, because there seems to be almost overwhelmingly total support amongst Israelis for the fight against Hezbollah. That seems to have changed. Do you think what's going on today, on the 7th of October 2024, in Israel is more peaceful, or at least looking more positively on Benjamin Netanyahu, than it might have done had Lebanon not happened?
He is in the process of climbing himself out of a political hole, and he is, he has this reputation as the master of political comebacks. And after October the 7th, this reputation he had built up as Mr. Security was completely tarnished. And he fears, he's a man who really thinks about his legacy and his place in history. He fears that he will be remembered for October the 7th above anything else, and he's probably right. And what he has done in recent weeks, and he's very much, he claims total credit for example, he says, it was me that ordered the strike on Nasrallah. It was me. He makes sure that he's tied to all these recent, as Israel would see it, military successes of taking out Hezbollah's basically entire leadership in a series of airstrikes on Lebanon. So part of it is rewriting and repositioning himself historically, and if he can claim, emerge from this whole saga. I mean, at the moment there's no end in sight, but if he can emerge as the person who kind of rolled back Iran's axis of resistance across the Middle East, then he would see that as something to be proud of, and something that would put him down in Israeli history as one of their most successful prime ministers.
Yeah, I mean, he's looking for that, isn't he? But I'm wondering whether, in reality, they've taken out a lot of Hamas's leadership, for example, but everything you read and see about in Gaza is that, the day-to-day on the streets, Hamas is still very much an integral part of life there. Hezbollah, by all accounts, are a larger, more well-oiled, better equipped machine than Hamas ever was. I'm just wondering whether the reality is that he hasn't actually made an awful lot of progress in what he's aiming for, compared to the headlines that he likes to put out.
Well, I mean, you've got to go back to what were the war aims in Gaza, and they were, one, to destroy Hamas, which is very arguable. It's basically a Sunni ideology, a radical Islamist ideology. Are you really going to eliminate that through military operation? I think most, foreign generals at least would say that's arguable. And then the other war aim was to release the hostages, and as we've already discussed, there are still hostages languishing in awful conditions in tunnels under Gaza. So on their own accounts, they have not succeeded in what they aimed to do when they went into Gaza. And then, in Lebanon, they have, yes, wiped out a lot of Hezbollah's senior leadership, but their aim on this one is to return 60,000 displaced Israelis to communities along the north. So let's see where we are in 6 months if that does happen. But, judging by what they've done in Gaza so much, you'd have to say they have not succeeded by their own terms, and not even accounting for the over 42,000 people, which is just an unbelievable figure, who have died in Gaza, according to the health ministry there. You've
started doing what I was about to do next, which is to look forward. You mentioned 6 months. I was going to take it as far as a year and ask you, where you see the Middle East in a year's time. I mean, A, is Benjamin Netanyahu still there? B, is there likely to still be support for him? C, what are the positions of Hezbollah and Hamas? And D, I guess, is Iran at that point brought more officially into things? Awful lot of questions in one there, but, where do you see this year to come?
On Netanyahu, well, I mean, he has a moment of political danger later when he has to give evidence to his corruption trial. But there's no way to force an election until 2026 unless ministers collapse his government. So I don't see that happening unless a year is a long time in politics. But and the kind of corollary of that is that if he has to maintain town, he has to maintain his coalition, then, he has ministers, Ben Gvir, who used to say, I would collapse your government if you stopped fighting in Gaza, is now saying the same in Lebanon. So he has the internal pressures all driving him towards increasing the conflict. The question is, Hezbollah is a more powerful adversary than Hamas. They do have battle-hardened soldiers who fought alongside Assad in Syria, and they're fighting in their home territory in southern Lebanon. If the Israelis do get sucked in, and they've even just today they've deployed another division up there, they started its limited operations. If they do get sucked in and start taking more and more casualties, what is the appetite of the Israeli public for seeing coffins returned from southern Lebanon? So that's a tension I could see developing over time. At the moment, there's been a kind of acceptance about Israeli soldiers dying in Gaza, but it could be even higher in Lebanon. And then with Iran, this is something we've now seen twice, two flare-ups between Israel and Iran directly. I think a lot of that is contingent on the US elections, and if you have a Harris or a Trump presidency, I would imagine Harris would be urging restraint on that front, and bear in mind on something so major as kind of launching an attack on Iran, Israel does have to have discussions with the Americans, and they, at the moment they're haggling over kind of which targets, but a kind of a broader conflict would definitely require US backing. So, it's entirely contingent on US politics, I think, that one.
And just finally, can you in any way foresee a point in time where we're not talking about this, where we are, getting people round the table, possibly to talk about a two-state solution? Who knows where it ends up exactly, but where we go, the sort of, to put it in depressing terms, the death element of this is over.
Yeah, I don't see any end to it, to be honest. It's a spiral of violence on both sides that I, at the moment, can't see any end to. You need titanic political figures on both sides, on the Palestinian and on the Israeli side, to make something happen. And at the moment, you have fairly extreme versions of government in both Israel and obviously in different parts of the occupied Palestinian territories. So, the idea of a two-state solution, I mean, I think first get to a ceasefire and then start talking about that. But, at the moment, this Israeli government has been pursuing a pretty aggressive policy of settlement in the West Bank, and Netanyahu has always been opposed to two-state. And so, I don't see that on the horizon anytime soon.